Picture this. You're standing in chains, surrounded by thousands of screaming spectators who paid good money to watch you die. The sand beneath your feet is still wet with the blood of yesterday's fighters. Your opponent? A battle mage who's killed 73 slaves just like you. And you? You don't even know if you have magic. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom in a world that's designed to break you. Sometimes, when you've got absolutely nothing left to lose, that's when you discover you had everything to gain all along. This is the story of someone who started with less than nothing. Someone who wasn't supposed to survive their first day. Someone who the entire world had written off as disposable, forgettable, worthless. But what the world didn't know, what even he didn't know, was that inside that broken body and shattered spirit lived something that would shake the very foundations of the magical arena system. This is about transformation. This is about survival against odds so steep they'd make most people quit before they even started. This is about proving that your beginning doesn't determine your ending. So settle in, because we're about to dive into a journey that starts in the darkest pit you can imagine and climbs all the way to heights nobody thought possible. This is the story of how a nameless slave became a legend that even the gods themselves would remember. The morning sun hadn't even broken over the horizon when they came for him. Not with gentle words or careful hands, but with the crack of a whip and the rattle of iron chains. In this world, if you were born without a family name, without land, without coin, you were born into one destiny and one destiny only. You were merchandise. You were property. You were a body that someone else owned, and your life had exactly as much value as they decided to give it. Our protagonist learned this lesson early. So early that he couldn't even remember a time when the weight of chains around his wrists felt strange. The slave markets of the lower districts operated with brutal efficiency. Children were sorted by size and strength. The weak ones went to the mines, where they'd dig until their lungs gave out from the dust. The average ones went to the fields, where they'd break their backs under the sun until their spines couldn't straighten anymore. But the ones who showed even a hint of physical capability, they went somewhere far worse. They went to the arena. The Crimson Colosseum wasn't just any fighting pit. It was the crown jewel of the Empire's entertainment industry, a massive structure of stone and magic that could hold 50,000 screaming spectators. It was where nobles came to bet on blood, where merchants came to scout for profitable fighters, where commoners came to forget their own miserable lives by watching people die in creative ways. The arena was fed by a constant stream of slaves, criminals, and desperate volunteers who thought they could win their freedom. Most of them were wrong. The slave caravan that carried our protagonist to the Colosseum took 3 days. 3 days packed in a wagon with 40 other people, all of them branded with the slave mark, all of them trying not to think about what waited at the end of the journey. Some of the others talked big. They'd heard stories about arena champions who fought their way to freedom, who earned enough coin and glory to buy their way into a better life. They convinced themselves they'd be different. They convinced themselves they'd survive. He didn't have those delusions. He'd seen too much already. 10 years of slavery had taught him exactly how much mercy the world held for people like him, which was to say none at all. He'd watched stronger people than him get broken. He'd watched cleverer people than him get crushed. He knew the statistics. 90% of slave fighters died in their first match. Of the 10% who survived, 90% of those died within their first month. The math wasn't encouraging. But here's the thing about being at the absolute bottom, about having every shred of hope systematically beaten out of you. It creates a strange kind of clarity. When you stop hoping for rescue, when you stop believing in miraculous salvation, you start seeing the world exactly as it is. And what he saw was simple. He was going to be thrown into that arena whether he wanted to be or not. He was going to have to fight whether he felt ready or not. And if he was going to die anyway, then he might as well die trying something instead of giving up before the fight even started. The slave compound beneath the Colosseum was exactly as brutal as you'd expect. Hundreds of cages stacked on top of each other, each one barely large enough for a person to lie down in. The smell of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and fear hung thick in the air. Guards patrolled with shock rods that delivered jolts of painful magic to anyone who stepped out of line. Twice a day, they'd shove bowls of something that might charitably be called food through the cage bars. Once a week, they'd hose down the entire compound with cold water to deal with the filth. This was where fighters waited for their turn in the sand. The new arrivals were processed with mechanical efficiency. Branded again, this time with the Colosseum's mark. Checked for any obvious magical ability, though nobody expected slaves to have any. Given a number. Our protagonist became number 7,412. Not a name, not a person. Just another piece of inventory waiting to be used up and replaced. The veterans in the cages, the ones who'd survived more than a handful of fights, they'd size up the new arrivals with dead eyes. Most of them didn't bother offering advice. What was the point? The newcomers would either figure it out or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't the veterans' problem. But there was one older fighter, a scarred man with one working eye and a left arm that didn't quite bend right anymore, who broke the silence. "First piece of advice," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Don't make friends. Everyone you meet here is either going to die or going to watch you die. Second piece of advice, if they throw you against a trained mage, go for the throat immediately. Don't hesitate. Don't try to be honorable, just try to end it before they can cast anything complicated. You might still die, but at least it'll be quick instead of being burned alive or having your insides turn to ice. Third piece of advice?" He paused, and something almost like pity crossed his features. "There is no third piece of advice. That's all I've got." The waiting was its own special kind of torture. Every morning, guards would come through and select fighters for that day's matches. They'd call out numbers, and those people would be dragged from their cages and herded toward the preparation areas. Some of them would come back. Most wouldn't. The empty cages would be cleaned and refilled with new arrivals within hours. The machine kept running, kept grinding up lives and spitting out corpses. Our protagonist spent 5 days in that cage before his number got called. 5 days of listening to the roar of the crowd filtering down from above. 5 days of watching other slaves get dragged away and not return. 5 days of feeling his body grow weaker from the poor food and cramped conditions. 5 days of knowing that every hour that passed was 1 hour closer to his turn. And then, on the 5th day, early in the morning before the sun had fully risen, a guard stopped in front of his cage. 7,412. You're up. The preparation area was barely better than the cages. A large room where dozens of slaves milled around, all of them scheduled for matches that day. Guards distributed basic weapons from racks on the walls, dull swords, chipped spears, shields with splits in the wood. Nothing that would give a slave a real advantage. The whole point was for the fights to be entertaining, and entertainment meant that the underdog should struggle before they inevitably lost. "Pick something," a guard barked at him. "Doesn't matter what. You'll be dead before lunch anyway." The weapon racks held dozens of options, all of them terrible. But his eyes caught on something near the back. A pair of short blades, more like long daggers than proper swords. They were pitted with rust, and the handles were wrapped in stained leather that was coming apart. Nobody else had touched them, probably because they looked like the worst option in a room full of bad options. But something about them felt right. Maybe it was because they were small enough that his malnourished arms could actually swing them. Maybe it was because with 2 blades, if one broke, he'd still have another. Maybe it was just instinct. He picked them up, felt their weight, tested a few basic movements. They were unbalanced and crude, but they'd have to do. A guard noticed and laughed. "Twin blades? What are you going to do? Make them dinner? Hope you've got some speed to go with those, slave, because you'll need it." The tunnel leading to the arena floor was long and dark. The sound of the crowd grew louder with every step. 50,000 people chanting, screaming, demanding blood and spectacle. The noise hit like a physical wall when they finally shoved him out onto the sand. The morning sun was bright and harsh after the darkness of the preparation area. The Colosseum rose around him in tiers of stone and magic, every seat filled with people who'd paid to watch him die. Across the sand, maybe 50 paces away, stood his opponent. The man was massive, not just tall, but built like a fortress, with arms as thick as tree trunks, and a chest that looked like it could stop a battering ram. He wore actual armor, real metal plate that gleamed in the sunlight, not the scraps and rags that slaves were given. In his hands, he carried a war hammer that probably weighed more than our protagonist's entire body. But the worst part, the part that made his stomach drop, was the shimmer of power around the man's body. Mana, visible mana, which meant this wasn't just some bruiser. This was a trained combat mage. The arena announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum, enhanced by magical amplification. For your entertainment this morning, we have a special treat. In the red corner, standing undefeated with 37 victories, the Boulder of the East, Marcus the Breaker. The crowd erupted in cheers. Marcus raised his hammer and roared, and the mana around him flared bright enough to hurt the eyes. And in the blue corner, making his arena debut, a fresh slave who probably can't even spell his own name. Will he last 5 minutes? Will he last 5 seconds? Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. The crowd laughed. They actually laughed. To them, this wasn't a life or death struggle. This was comedy. This was the opening act, the throwaway match before the real entertainment started. They'd already decided he was going to die. They were just curious about how messy it would be. A horn blasted across the arena. The match had started. Marcus didn't waste time with showboating. He charged forward with shocking speed for someone his size, the warhammer already swinging in a wide arc that would have pulverized bones if it connected. Our protagonist's body moved on instinct, diving to the side, feeling the wind of the hammer's passage as it smashed into the sand where he'd been standing. The impact cratered the ground. One hit. That's all it would take. One hit, and he'd be paced. He rolled, came up running, his twin blades feeling pathetically small in his hands. Marcus spun, faster than someone wearing full plate had any right to move, and swung again. This time, the hammer glowed with orange light. Fire magic, heating the metal to temperatures that would sear flesh even without direct contact. The weapon passed within inches of our protagonist's chest as he threw himself backward, close enough that he felt his tattered shirt start to smoke. The crowd was going wild now. They loved this, loved watching the desperate scramble to survive, loved the spectacle of the hunt. Marcus laughed, a deep booming sound that carried across the arena. "Come on, rat, give them a show before I squash you." The hammer swung again, and again, each blow powerful enough to kill instantly if it connected. And each time, somehow, our protagonist managed to dodge. Not through skill, not through training, just through pure, desperate survival instinct, the kind that kicks in when death is measured in fractions of seconds. But dodging wasn't winning. Dodging was just delaying the inevitable. His lungs were already burning from the exertion. His malnourished body didn't have the stamina for this. Marcus knew it too. The big man wasn't even breathing hard. He was just pacing himself, wearing down his prey, knowing that eventually the slave would be too tired to dodge and then it would be over. Our protagonist's mind raced. There had to be something, some kind of advantage he could create. Marcus was stronger, better equipped, better trained, and had actual magic. But magic required concentration, didn't it? The old fighter's advice echoed in his memory. Go for the throat. Don't hesitate. The next time Marcus swung, instead of dodging away, our protagonist dodged toward. He ducked under the hammer's arc and lunged forward, both blades aiming for the gap between Marcus's helmet and chest plate. It was a desperate move, probably a stupid move, but it was the only move he had. The blades struck metal and bounced off. Marcus's armor was too good, but the attack forced Marcus to step back, to reset his stance. For just a second, their eyes met, and our protagonist saw something in Marcus's expression. Surprise. The big man hadn't expected any resistance at all. Hadn't expected the slave to try anything. Most of them just ran until they couldn't run anymore. That surprise bought one more second, one more heartbeat, one more moment of not being dead. The fight continued. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't heroic. It was scrappy and desperate and ugly. Every exchange was our protagonist throwing himself at Marcus, trying to find any gap in that armor, trying to do any damage at all, and then scrambling away before the hammer could crush him. The crowd's laughter had faded. They were actually watching now. This was lasting longer than they'd expected. 3 minutes turned into 5. 5 turned into 7. Marcus was getting frustrated now. The easy kill was proving not so easy. His swings became wilder, more aggressive, which made them more dangerous but also created larger openings. Our protagonist's body was running on fumes, operating past the point where it should have collapsed from exhaustion. His vision was narrowing. His movements were getting sloppier. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. Then Marcus made a mistake. He overcommitted on a massive overhead swing, putting everything behind it, trying to end the fight with one spectacular blow. The hammer came down like a meteor. Our protagonist rolled to the side, felt the ground shake from the impact, and for once Marcus's weapon stuck in the sand for just a second. That second was all he had. He threw himself forward, not at Marcus's armor, but at his face, at the eyes. The rusted blades weren't sharp enough to pierce armor, but they could scratch unprotected skin. One blade scraped across Marcus's cheek. Not a deep wound, not even a particularly dangerous wound, but enough to draw blood, enough to make Marcus flinch, enough to make the big man stumble backward. The crowd's roar changed pitch. This was unexpected. This was exciting. The impossible was becoming possible, if only for a moment. But that moment was all they got. Marcus roared in genuine anger now. The playfulness was gone. He activated his full combat magic, and flames erupted around his body. The temperature in the arena spiked. Our protagonist felt his skin start to blister just from being near. Marcus charged like a burning avalanche. There was nowhere to dodge to. The flames were too widespread. The speed was too fast. This was it. This was the end. Time seemed to slow down. In that stretched moment, our protagonist thought about the unfairness of it all. How he'd never had a chance. How he'd been born into chains and would die in chains. How the world had decided his worth before he'd even had a chance to prove otherwise. And somewhere in that bitterness, in that rage at the cosmic injustice of it all, something inside him cracked. Not physically. Spiritually. It felt like a dam breaking. Like pressure that had been building for 10 years of suffering suddenly finding release. Heat flooded through his body, but not from Marcus's flames. This was internal. This was something that had been locked away, dormant, waiting. His vision blurred and then sharpened. The world took on strange colors. And in his mind, clear as day, he felt something that he'd never felt before. Magic. Not the controlled, trained magic of a combat mage. This was raw. This was primal. This was the desperate awakening of someone whose soul refused to die quietly. He didn't know what he was doing. Didn't know how to shape it or control it. But instinct took over. The same survival instinct that had kept him alive this long. The magic poured into his rusted blades, and they began to glow. Not with fire, with something else. Something hungry. When Marcus's burning charge reached him, our protagonist didn't dodge. He met it head-on. The twin blades crossed in an X pattern, caught the flaming warhammer between them, and held. The impact drove him to his knees. The sand under his feet fused into glass from the heat. His muscles screamed in protest. But he held. And as he held, He felt his awakened magic fighting against Marcus's magic. Two forces colliding, two wills battling for dominance. The crowd had gone silent, 50,000 people holding their breath. Marcus pressed down with all his strength, trying to drive the hammer through the guard and crush the slave beneath him. But something was wrong. His flames were flickering. The magic he'd trained for years to control was becoming unstable. Because whatever the slave had awakened wasn't following the normal rules. It wasn't elemental magic. It wasn't enhancement magic. It was something else, something that felt like it was draining the mana from the air itself. For 3 heartbeats, they stayed locked in that position. Marcus pushing down with everything he had, our protagonist barely holding, his arms shaking from the strain. Then with a sound like breaking glass, the Warhammer's enchantments shattered. The flames went out. The weapon became just heavy metal with no magic sustaining it. Marcus's eyes went wide with shock. Our protagonist moved, not gracefully, not skillfully, but with every ounce of desperate strength left in his body. He twisted the blades, using Marcus's own momentum against him, and the big man stumbled forward. For just an instant, he was off balance. For just an instant, his neck was exposed. The twin blades found their mark. Not deep. The angle was wrong. The strength wasn't there. But they bit into the gap between helmet and chest plate, just enough to sever something important. Marcus dropped the hammer. His hands went to his throat. He took 2 stumbling steps backward. Then he fell. The arena was dead silent. Our protagonist stood there, swaying, barely conscious, covered in burns and cuts, his borrowed blades dripping red. He couldn't quite process what had just happened. Couldn't understand how he was still standing when Marcus wasn't. Around him, the silence stretched and stretched until it became unbearable. Then someone in the crowd cheered, just one person. But that single cheer broke the dam. Suddenly, the entire colosseum was screaming. Not in mockery this time, in genuine shock and excitement. The impossible had just happened. A slave in his first match, with no training, had just defeated a champion mage. Guards rushed onto the sand, but not to help him. To drag him back to the preparation area before the crowd's excitement could turn into something dangerous. Before people started asking questions about how a slave could have magic when all slaves were supposed to be powerless. As they pulled him away, his vision already fading from exhaustion and blood loss, the last thing he heard was the announcer's voice, trying to regain control of the narrative. What an upset, ladies and gentlemen. What an incredible stroke of luck. The slave survives his first match through pure chance and Marcus's overconfidence. Will he survive his second? Return tomorrow to find out. They threw him back in his cage, didn't treat his wounds, didn't give him extra food, just locked the door and left him to either recover or die on his own. But he was alive. Against every odd, against every expectation, he was alive. And that awakening, that crack in the spiritual dam that had released his magic for the first time, it wasn't closing back up. Now that it was open, now that he knew it was there, he could feel it constantly. A warm presence in his core, growing stronger with every breath. The scarred veteran in the next cage watched him with new interest. "You're one of those," he said quietly. "One of the accidental awakeners. Happened to me once, way back. Thought I was special. Thought I'd found something that would change everything." He paused, his expression unreadable. "You want to know what happens next? They'll watch you closer now. The arena owners, they don't like surprises. Don't like slaves with power. So they'll put you against stronger opponents. Keep testing you until they find your limit and break you past it. That's what they do with awakeners. They burn them bright and fast before they can become a problem." But our protagonist wasn't listening to the warning. He was staring at his hands, watching small sparks of that strange magic dance across his fingers. For 10 years, he'd been powerless. For 10 years, he'd been at the mercy of everyone stronger than him. For 10 years, he'd been nothing. But maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. The question wasn't whether he could survive. The question was how far he could rise before they found a way to kill him. And for the first time in his entire life, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the answer to that question could be interesting. Tomorrow they'd throw him into the sand again. Tomorrow they'd try to kill him with someone even stronger. But tomorrow wasn't here yet. Right now, in this cage, with magic thrumming through his veins for the first time, he allowed himself something he'd never dared feel before. Hope. Dangerous thing, hope. It could keep you alive when you should have died. Or it could make your eventual death hurt that much more. Either way, he was going to find out. The road from slave to legend had just begun, and it was going to be written in blood, sweat, and magic that refused to play by anyone's rules but its own. They didn't give him time to recover. The arena's business model didn't allow for rest. Spectators paid for daily shows, and those shows needed fresh blood to keep things interesting. When the guards came for him the next morning, his body was still one massive bruise from the fight with Marcus. The burns on his skin had barely started to heal. His muscles felt like they'd been pounded by rocks. But none of that mattered to the system. He could walk, which meant he could fight. The preparation area was different this time. Word had spread overnight about the slave who'd killed a champion on his first day. Some of the other fighters looked at him with curiosity. Most looked at him with resentment. He'd become interesting, and in the arena economy, interesting meant potentially valuable, which meant the rest of them were comparatively less valuable. "Heard you got lucky yesterday," one of them sneered. "Caught a champion off guard. Won't happen twice." He didn't respond, didn't have the energy for pointless posturing. Instead, he focused inward, on that presence of magic that was still there, still real. He tried to pull on it deliberately this time, tried to make it respond to his will rather than just his desperation. It flickered to life in his hands, that same strange, hungry quality to it, before fading out. He didn't know how to sustain it, didn't know how to shape it. But it was there. That was what mattered. An older guard, one who'd been working the Colosseum for decades, pulled him aside. "Listen carefully, slave. What happened yesterday? That awakening? You might think it makes you special. It doesn't. I've seen 50 awakeners in my time here. You know how many are still alive? One. Just one. And he's broken in ways you can't imagine." The guard's expression was hard to read. Not quite sympathy, but not cruelty either. The arena owners, they'll give you better food now, better weapons, maybe even a cage to yourself. They'll invest in you because you're an asset. But the moment you stop winning, the moment you stop being profitable, they'll throw you to the wolves and find the next interesting slave. "So what should I do?" His voice came out hoarse from disuse. The guard shrugged. "Win, keep winning. That's the only move any of us have." His second match was scheduled for mid-afternoon, which meant hours of waiting while other fights played out. Each horn blast from above marked another life ended. The preparation area gradually emptied as fighters were called and didn't return. By the time they finally called his number, only a handful remained. 7,412. "You're up. Let's see if yesterday was a fluke." This time, they gave him proper twin short swords instead of rusted garbage. Not because they cared about his survival, but because the crowd wanted to see if the slave who'd awakened magic could do it again. The swords were plain but functional, and after years of having nothing, even basic weapons felt like a gift. The tunnel to the arena had a different quality now. He wasn't walking to certain death. He was walking to very probable death, which was a meaningful improvement. The roar of the crowd hit just as hard as yesterday, but this time he was expecting it. 50,000 people who wanted to see him bleed, wanted to see if lightning could strike twice. His opponent was already in the sand when he emerged. Not a massive bruiser like Marcus. This was something worse. A woman in light armor, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent their entire life training for combat. Twin scimitars hung at her sides, and the air around her shimmered with wind magic. She wasn't a slave. She was a volunteer, someone who fought in the arena for coin and glory. The announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we test the limits of yesterday's surprise. Can the awakened slave repeat his miracle? Or will he learn that beginner's luck runs out?" In the red corner, with 42 victories and only 3 defeats, the Stormblade herself, Cassandra. Cassandra didn't acknowledge the crowd's cheers. She was studying him with cold professional interest, the way a butcher might study a particularly troublesome cut of meat. When the starting horn sounded, she didn't charge. She circled, forcing him to turn with her, evaluating his stance and movement. "You awakened during combat," she called out, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "That means you're running on instinct with no control. Let me teach you why training matters." She attacked like a hurricane, not with overwhelming power, but with precision and speed that made Marcus's assault look clumsy by comparison. Her scimitars became silver blurs enhanced by wind magic. Our protagonist managed to block the first 3 strikes through pure reflex. The 4th one opened a cut across his shoulder. The 5th drew blood from his thigh. She was picking him apart, demonstrating the gulf between raw power and refined skill. The crowd loved it. This was the narrative they'd expected. The fluke was being exposed. Natural order was being restored. Cassandra pressed her advantage, her wind magic creating small cutting vortexes that forced him backward. He tried to summon his own magic, tried to make it respond like it had against Marcus, but it remained dormant. Apparently, his awakened power only came out when he was about to die, which meant he needed to be closer to death. The thought was insane, but it was the only strategy he had. So he stopped trying to defend efficiently, stopped trying to preserve himself. He threw himself into reckless attacks, trading injuries for position, accepting cuts that could have been avoided if it meant getting inside Cassandra's guard. It was the opposite of proper technique. It was suicidal. It was working. Cassandra's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. He wasn't fighting like someone trying to win. He was fighting like someone trying to force a specific outcome. And as his blood painted the sand beneath them, as his vision started to blur from blood loss, he felt it. That crack opening again. That pressure building. His magic responding to mortal danger the only way it knew how. The twin swords in his hands began to glow with that same hungry light from yesterday. Not fire, not lightning. Something that seemed to devour the ambient mana in the air, creating small distortions in the space around the blades. Cassandra noticed and immediately backed off, her professional instincts screaming danger. "What kind of magic is that?" she demanded. He didn't know, didn't have words for it, but he could feel it pulling at her wind magic, trying to unravel the spells she'd woven around her weapons. It was disruptive magic. Anti-magic. The antithesis of controlled, disciplined spell work. When their weapons clashed again, her enchantments destabilized. The wind magic flickered and died. For the first time, uncertainty crossed her features. The fight's momentum shifted. Without her enhancement magic, Cassandra was still more skilled, but the gap was smaller. And our protagonist had already committed to the reckless approach. He pressed forward, accepting injuries to deliver his own, each strike powered by magic that seemed to feed on his desperation. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't honorable. But it was effective. Cassandra adapted quickly, credit to her training. She stopped relying on magic and focused on pure technique. For several exchanges, they fought as equals, blade meeting blade, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The crowd was going wild. This was genuine entertainment now. Real uncertainty about who would win. Then Cassandra made her move. She feinted high, dropped low, and swept his legs. He went down hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Her scimitar was already descending toward his exposed neck. This was it. The execution blow. The moment where the fluke ended. Except his awakened magic had different ideas. It surged without his conscious control, pouring into his hands, and when he threw them up in a desperate defensive gesture, something impossible happened. The magic solidified in the air between his palms and Cassandra's blade. Not a physical barrier. More like a distortion in reality itself, a space where magic simply stopped working. The scimitar hit that zone and the motion just stopped, as if it had struck an invisible wall. Cassandra's eyes went wide. She tried to pull back, but the magic had created some kind of temporary binding. Her weapon was stuck. And in that frozen moment, he drove his own blade upward, catching her in the side, sliding between the gaps in her light armor. It wasn't a killing blow. His angle was wrong, his strength fading, but it was enough to make her stumble back, bleeding, her weapon still trapped in that impossible space. He struggled to his feet, barely able to stand. She held her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Both of them were done. Both of them knew it. The question was who would collapse first. The answer was neither. The arena officials called the match before they could finish each other off. Not out of mercy, but because both fighters were too valuable to waste. A slave who could perform magic impossibilities, and a champion who'd nearly won anyway. They'd keep both alive to generate more ticket sales tomorrow. Guards swarmed the sand. Healers were already rushing out, professional medics who'd patch them up enough to fight again soon. As they loaded our protagonist onto a stretcher, he caught Cassandra's eye. She gave him a small nod. Recognition. Respect. Not as equals, but acknowledgement that he was more than disposable trash. It was something. Back in the medical area, the healers worked with practiced efficiency. They weren't gentle, but they were effective. The worst of the cuts were sealed with basic healing magic. The blood loss was addressed with alchemical potions that tasted like metal and dirt. Within an hour, he was back in his cage, technically alive, technically ready to be thrown into the sand again whenever the arena wanted him. But something had changed. The cage next to his was no longer empty. They'd moved another fighter to be his neighbor. A young man, maybe 20 years old, with the hard eyes of someone who'd been fighting a lot longer than his age, suggested. "Name's Kale," the young man said. "Saw your fight today. You're doing it wrong." "Doing what wrong?" "The magic. You're just throwing it out there like a drowning man thrashing at water. That works once, maybe twice. But eventually you'll fight someone who knows how to deal with wild awakeners, and they'll tear you apart." Kyle leaned closer to the bars separating their cages. "I can teach you. Not much. Just enough to survive a little longer. In exchange, you watch my back during group matches. Why help me?" Kale's expression darkened. "Because I've been trying to die honorably for 6 months now, and the arena won't let me. They keep pairing me against easy opponents, dragging it out, making me rack up wins I don't want. But if I make a deal with you, if we become a team, they'll throw harder challenges at us. And maybe finally I'll get the death I'm looking for." It was the most depressingly pragmatic offer of help he'd ever received. But it was still help. "What do I need to do?" "First," Kale said, "stop thinking of the magic as something separate from you. It's not a tool you pick up. It's part of you. Right now, it only comes out when you're dying, because that's when you stop overthinking and just exist. You need to learn to access that state consciously." Over the next several hours, between guard patrols, Kyle walked him through basic meditation techniques. Nothing fancy, just ways to focus inward, to find that core of power and touch it deliberately instead of waiting for desperation to force it out. It was harder than fighting, harder than bleeding. The moment he tried to grasp the magic consciously, it slipped away like smoke. "Stop trying to control it," Kale advised. "You can't control it yet. Just try to notice it, acknowledge it, be aware of it existing even when you're not dying." Hours passed. The colosseum above went quiet as evening came. In the darkness of the cage, surrounded by the smell of fear and the distant sound of other slaves crying, he sat with his eyes closed and searched for that part of himself that had awakened. Searched for the magic that had saved his life twice now. And eventually, like finding a familiar face in a crowd, he felt it. Not as a tool, not as a separate thing, as part of his own spirit that had always been there but locked away. The moment he stopped trying to grab it and just acknowledged its presence, it responded. A small warmth in his chest, a gentle glow around his fingers. There, Kyle whispered. You've got it. Now the hard part. Keeping it. That first night was the beginning of something that the arena owners hadn't anticipated. They'd thought the awakened slave would burn bright and fast, providing a few exciting matches before inevitably dying. But what they'd accidentally created was someone who could learn. Someone who had a reason to survive beyond just making it to tomorrow. Someone who was starting to understand the power inside him. The magic was still wild, still unpredictable. But now he could feel it even when death wasn't imminent. That was progress. That was the difference between a fluke and a fighter. 2 days later, they called both him and Kale for a paired match. 2 against 4. Bad odds, but not impossible. Especially not when one of them had death wishes, and the other had nothing to lose. When they stepped onto the sand together, the crowd recognized him immediately. The slave who'd somehow won twice. The Awakener. They cheered not for him, but for the spectacle he represented. And that was fine. He didn't need their approval. He just needed to keep not dying. Their opponents were standard arena fodder. Criminals fighting for reduced sentences. Competent but not exceptional. Under normal circumstances, 2 versus 4 would be a quick slaughter. But these weren't normal circumstances. Kyle was a revelation in combat. Every movement precise. Every strike measured. He fought with the tired perfection of someone who'd been doing this too long, and he carved through 2 opponents in the time it took our protagonist to barely hold off one. The magic came easier this time. Not naturally, but easier than before. He could summon small bursts of it, could disrupt his opponent's stance at critical moments, could make his weapons unexpectedly deadly when it mattered. They won. Bloody, exhausted, but alive. The crowd's roar washed over them like a physical wave. Our protagonist realized something in that moment. The arena didn't care about justice or fairness or any higher principle. It just cared about entertainment. And if he could be entertaining enough, if he could give them matches worth watching, they'd keep him alive. Not because they valued him as a person, but because he was profitable. Fine. He could work with that. Back in the cages that night, Kale spoke again. You're getting faster at summoning it. The magic. Good. But you're still treating it like a weapon. It's not. It's a part of you. And every part of a fighter has to work together. What do you mean? I mean you're thinking of yourself as a normal fighter who sometimes has magic. That's wrong. You need to think of yourself as magic that happens to use swords. Big difference. The distinction seemed subtle, but as our protagonist meditated on it, he started to understand. The magic wasn't something he added to his fighting. His fighting was an expression of the magic. His movements, his tactics, his survival instincts, they were all just different ways for the power inside him to manifest in the world. It was going to take time to truly internalize that. Time he might not have. But for now, for tonight, he was alive. And somewhere in the depths of his awakened power, something was starting to stir. Something that would change everything. The question wasn't whether he'd survive. The question was what he'd become by the time survival was no longer the only goal. The arena was about to find out that creating an awakener wasn't the same as controlling one, and that lesson was going to be expensive. 3 weeks in the arena changed a person in ways that months of slavery couldn't. In those 21 days, our protagonist fought 12 times. Each match pushed him closer to death. Each victory surprised the crowd a little less. The novelty was wearing off. He was becoming routine. And in arena economics, routine meant disposable. But those 3 weeks also brought something else. Training. Real training, delivered in stolen moments between matches. Whispered lessons from Kyle and a few other veteran fighters who'd decided he might be worth the investment. The magic that had awakened in desperation was slowly, painfully, becoming something he could actually use deliberately. The key breakthrough came during his 8th match. He'd been facing a fire mage, someone with actual formal magical education, and he'd been losing badly. His anti-magic disruption could slow down spells, but it couldn't stop them entirely, not when he didn't understand the principles behind what he was doing. The fire mage had been toying with him, showing off for the crowd, when something clicked in our protagonist's mind. He'd been thinking about his magic as a defensive thing, something that disrupted others' power. But Kale had been right. That was backwards thinking. His magic wasn't anti-magic. It was hunger magic. It didn't just disrupt other spells. It consumed them, fed on them. And if he could consume enemy magic, why couldn't he consume other things? When the fire mage launched another massive flame spell, instead of dodging or trying to disrupt it, our protagonist did something insane. He ran toward it, straight into the flames, and as the fire touched his skin, he pulled, not with his hands, with his magic, with that core of hunger that had been dormant his entire life. The flames stopped hurting. They stopped existing as fire. Instead, they became fuel. Raw mana being absorbed directly into his system, feeding the starved well of power inside him. The crowd gasped. The fire mage's confident expression crumbled into confusion, and our protagonist felt the surge of energy flooding his body. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before he lost control and the absorption cut off. But in those 3 seconds, he'd taken enough power to make his counterattack decisive. One moment of supernatural speed. One perfect strike. The fire mage went down. That night, in his cage, he practiced, over and over, trying to recreate that moment of successful absorption. It was like trying to catch water in his bare hands. Every time he thought he understood the technique, it slipped away. But even failed attempts were progress. Even understanding what didn't work brought him closer to understanding what did. Kyle watched with something approaching genuine interest. "You're learning faster than most," he admitted. "Most awakeners, they get one trick and that's all they ever master. You're actually adapting, evolving. It's rare. Is that good? Depends on your goals. If you want to live long enough to earn freedom, then yes. If you want to avoid becoming a permanent prisoner of the arena system, then no. The better you get, the more valuable you become. The more valuable you become, the harder they'll work to keep you." It was the central dilemma facing anyone who survived more than a few matches. Success meant continued survival, but it also meant being too profitable to ever release. The arena's greatest champions, the ones with hundreds of victories, were prisoners in gilded cages. They had coin, comfort, status, everything except freedom. But that was a problem for future him to worry about. Present him still had to survive each day. The matches started coming faster. 2 per week became 3. 3 became 4. The arena owners were capitalizing on his growing reputation while it was hot. Every fight brought a little more coin into their coffers. Every victory made the next opponent slightly more dangerous. They were gradually escalating, testing the limits of what he could handle. Most fights blurred together. Competent opponents who he managed to outlast through a combination of growing skill and sheer stubbornness. But there were notable exceptions. Fights that taught him things about himself and his magic. There was the match against the twin assassins, where he learned that his absorption didn't just work on direct magic. If he concentrated, he could drain enchanted items too. Their poisoned blades lost their potency mid-fight, leaving them with just steel he could deal with. There was the match against the Earth Mage who tried to entomb him, where he discovered that his magic could disrupt solid spells in progress. The stone prison shattered before it finished forming. The Earth Mage spent the rest of the fight looking confused about why none of his normally reliable techniques were working properly. There was the match against the Ice Warrior, where he learned the hard way that absorption had limits. He'd tried to consume a massive blizzard spell and ended up nearly freezing himself solid because he couldn't process that much energy at once. He won, barely, but spent 3 days recovering from magical overconsumption. Each fight was a lesson, each scar was a reminder, the magic was powerful, but it was also dangerous. Not just to his enemies, to him. Using it recklessly could kill him as surely as any opponent's blade. Between matches, life in the slave compound developed a strange routine. He wasn't just number 7,412 anymore. The other fighters knew his face. Some respected him. Some resented him. A few tried to befriend him, hoping his success would rub off. Kyle remained his closest ally, teaching combat theory during the long hours of waiting. The arena has patterns, Kale explained one evening. They build narratives. Right now, you're the underdog who keeps defying odds. That story is profitable, so they'll keep telling it. But eventually you'll win enough times that you stop being the underdog. Then you become something else. The veteran, the champion, the final boss for the next underdog to face. How long does that take? Depends on how fast you accumulate victories. For me, it took about 70 fights before I transitioned from rising star to established threat. That's when the matches stopped being about survival and started being about spectacle. 70 fights. The number seemed impossible. He'd only managed 23 so far, and each one felt like it could be his last. How did someone survive 70? How did someone maintain the focus and will to keep fighting when every victory just meant another dance with death? But looking at Kale's dead eyes, he realized the answer. You didn't maintain focus. You didn't keep the fire alive. You just became a machine. You stripped away everything that made you human until all that remained was the ability to fight and the inability to die. Kyle had survived 70 fights by killing everything inside him that cared about surviving. That wasn't the path our protagonist wanted. But what choice did he have? The arena didn't care about preferences. It cared about blood and coin. If he wanted to avoid becoming like Kale, he needed to find a different strategy. A way to break the cycle before the cycle broke him. His 25th match brought a surprise. Not an individual opponent, but a beast. The arena occasionally imported monsters from the frontier regions, creatures that had never been meant to face human opponents. This was one of those spectacles. A sand drake. 10 feet long, scaled armor, claws that could tear through stone, and breath that turned air to poison. When he walked onto the sand and saw what he'd be facing, genuine fear kicked in. The biggest human opponent had at least been human. Predictable. This was an alien intelligence, a predator that operated on instincts he couldn't anticipate. The announcer made it clear this was a special match, a chance for him to really prove himself worthy of the audience's continued attention. The sand drake moved like liquid violence, fast despite its size, turning on angles that defied physics. Its poisonous breath forced him to keep moving, never standing still, never giving it a clean shot at overwhelming him with toxic fumes. The twin swords felt pathetically small against scales that had been hardened by years of frontier survival. He tried the absorption technique, tried to drain whatever magical essence kept the drake's poison breath so potent. It worked, partially. The poison became less toxic, more manageable, but the drake had size and strength advantages that magic couldn't overcome. Every exchange left him with new cuts from near misses. every moment felt like he was one mistake away from being torn apart. The crowd loved it. This was the spectacle they'd paid for. Man versus monster. Civilization versus nature. All the primal narratives that humans had been telling themselves since they first learned to make fire. He lasted 8 minutes before he found an opening. The drake overextended on a strike, and he managed to drive both blades into the softer scales under its jaw. Not a killing blow, but painful enough to make the creature retreat. In that moment of reprieve, he made a decision. A desperate, probably stupid decision. Instead of pressing the attack, he dropped his weapons. The crowd's roar turned to confused muttering. The drake, equally confused, circled warily. And our protagonist reached out with his magic, not to disrupt or consume, but to connect. To touch the essence of this creature that was so different from him. To understand what drove it beyond just survival instinct. The connection lasted maybe 2 seconds. In that brief touching of minds, he felt the drake's reality. Captured from its territory. Forced into this artificial environment. Made to fight for the entertainment of creatures it didn't understand. It wasn't evil. It wasn't even particularly aggressive. It was just as trapped as he was. The connection broke. The drake lunged, but this time he didn't dodge with desperation. He moved with deliberate calm. His magic reached out again, not to control, but to suggest. To communicate in a way that went deeper than words, not commands, just understanding. The drake's claws stopped inches from his face, its poisonous breath held back. They stood there, predator and prey, locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Then the arena officials, recognizing that this wasn't going according to script, released a second drake. The crowd's confusion turned to excitement. 2 against 1. Now this was entertainment. But what they'd failed to account for was the possibility that the drakes, recognizing a common enemy in the system that trapped them both, might work together instead of competing for the kill. The second drake charged. The first drake intercepted. Not to protect our protagonist exactly. More like recognizing that the enemy wasn't the human in front of it, but the humans in the stands above. The battle that followed was chaos. 2 drakes fighting each other while he tried to stay alive in the crossfire. At some point, he picked up his swords again. At some point, he started actively helping the first drake against the second, because at least the first one had shown some capacity for reason. By the time the guards finally flooded the arena with enough force to separate the combatants, all 3 participants were bloodied, exhausted, and the carefully scripted narrative was completely shattered. The crowd had gotten their money's worth, but not in the way the arena had intended. Backstage, the arena master himself appeared. An old man in expensive robes, the kind of person who'd probably never held a weapon in his life, but held power over thousands who did. He studied our protagonist with calculating eyes. "That trick with the beast," the arena master said. "Can you do it again?" "I don't know. Maybe." "Good enough. I'm moving you to the special matches category. Beast tamer fights pay triple the normal gate receipts. You'll fight twice a week instead of 4 times. Better food, better accommodations. Hell, I'll even let you keep the first drake as a pet if you can actually train it." It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even close to freedom. But it was a different kind of prison. One with slightly better conditions and the promise of slightly more interesting fights. He accepted because what else was he going to do? That night, they moved him to a private cell. Still a cage, but larger. With actual bedding instead of bare stone. And in the corner, sedated but alive, the first sand drake. The one that had shown enough intelligence to recognize an ally. "You and me," he whispered to the unconscious creature. "We're going to figure out a way to survive this. Together." The drake's eye cracked open, regarded him with alien intelligence, then closed again. It was a start. The road from disposable slave to valuable asset had been survived. Now came the harder journey. figuring out how to turn valuable asset into something more. Something the arena couldn't control. Something that might actually have a chance at freedom. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in his life, he slept in relative comfort and dreamed of sand that wasn't covered in blood. The sand drake, which he'd started calling Ash for the gray streaks along its scales, became something unexpected. Not a pet. Not really a companion either. More like a reluctant business partner who happened to share a cage and a survival instinct. The first week was tense. Ash would test the boundaries constantly, lunging at him when it thought he wasn't paying attention, trying to establish dominance the way drakes did in the wild. But he had something the drake didn't. Magic that could touch minds, and patience born from 10 years of having absolutely no control over his circumstances. He didn't try to dominate Ash. Didn't try to break its spirit. Instead, he offered something revolutionary in the context of the arena. Choice. Every morning, he'd unlock the feeding mechanism on Ash's section of the cell. The drake could eat or not eat. Could approach him or stay distant. Could cooperate or remain hostile. And every morning, he'd sit in the corner with his eyes closed, reaching out with that thread of magical connection. Not pushing, just offering awareness. Letting Ash know that he saw the creature as something more than a tool. It took 11 days before Ash approached him voluntarily, nudged his shoulder with that massive scaled head. The gesture wasn't affection, it was acknowledgement. They were both prisoners. They could be miserable prisoners separately, or they could be slightly less miserable prisoners together. The arena master kept his word about better accommodations. The food improved from barely edible to actually nutritious. The private cell was cleaned daily instead of weekly. They even provided basic medical care between matches instead of just letting wounds fester. But the best part was the training time. 3 hours every morning in a private section of the practice grounds, where he could work with Ash without dozens of eyes watching. Where he could experiment with his magic without revealing every technique to potential future opponents. Where Kale could join them and continue the combat education that had kept him alive this long. "Your magic is getting more refined," Kale observed during one of these sessions. "But it's still reactive. You wait for threats and then respond. That works in the arena, but it's a limiting mindset. What else should I be doing? Thinking 3 moves ahead. Chess, not checkers. Every fight you should be learning something you can use in the next fight. Every technique should build toward a larger strategy." Kyle demonstrated with his own weapon, a pattern of strikes that looked random, but was actually setting up a finishing combination. "See? The first 5 moves don't matter on their own. They only matter because they create the opening for move 6. Our protagonist tried to apply that thinking to his magic. Instead of just absorbing enemy spells reactively, he started experimenting with absorption as an opening move. Drawing in ambient mana from his surroundings before fights even started, building up a reserve of power. It was harder than it sounded. The ambient mana was diffuse, hard to grasp, nothing like the concentrated energy of a direct spell. But slowly, painfully, he learned to pull it in. To store it in that core of hunger inside him. Ash proved useful in ways he hadn't anticipated. The drake had natural magical senses that humans lacked. It could feel concentrations of mana, could track magical signatures, could detect enchantments that were invisible to normal sight. When he practiced his absorption techniques, Ash would growl when the pull became too strong, warning him before he accidentally drained something critical or destabilized his own magic. They developed a communication system. Not quite language, but better than nothing. Pressure from Ash's tail meant danger from behind. A specific rumble meant magical threat detected. A headbutt to his left side meant move that direction. It wasn't sophisticated, but in the chaos of arena combat, any edge mattered. His first Beast Tamer match came 3 weeks after acquiring Ash. The format was different from standard fights. Him and Ash against a team of 3 fighters and their warhounds. The crowd had been primed to expect something special, and the betting was heavy on both sides. When they walked onto the sand together, Ash's presence changed the dynamic completely. The warhounds, trained to be aggressive, took one look at the Drake and reconsidered their life choices. The human fighters had prepared to face a novice beast tamer with a barely controlled monster. What they got was something that moved like a coordinated unit. The fight lasted 6 minutes. Our protagonist didn't even need to use his swords for most of it. Ash was a force of nature, and he'd learned to guide that force with subtle magical nudges rather than trying to control it. The warhounds broke and ran within the first minute. Their handlers lasted longer, but not much longer. When it was over, the crowd was screaming themselves hoarse, and the arena master was already calculating how much to charge for the next beast tamer spectacle. But success in the arena was a double-edged blade. Every victory made him more valuable. More valuable meant more investment. More investment meant tighter control. Within days, guards were assigned to watch his training sessions, not to help, to observe, to report back to the arena master about every technique he developed, every trick he practiced. The illusion of improved conditions started to crack. Yes, the cell was nicer. Yes, the food was better. But he was being studied like a valuable experiment. The arena master wanted to understand exactly what he could do so they could market it properly. Wanted to know his limits so they could push him right to the edge without accidentally killing their profitable asset. Kyle noticed the increased surveillance too. "This is the transition I warned you about," he said quietly during a rare moment when the guards were distracted. "You're no longer just a fighter. You're inventory. Property they're optimizing for maximum return. Next comes the contract." "What contract?" "They'll offer you a deal. Agree to fight exclusively for this arena for the next 5 years, and they'll give you a percentage of gate receipts. Sounds generous. Sounds like they're treating you as a partner instead of property. But read the fine print. That contract will bind you tighter than any chain, and if you refuse, they'll make your life miserable until you accept." The contract came exactly as predicted. 3 days after his 3rd beast tamer victory, the arena master summoned him to the administrative offices. A rare honor for a slave to be brought above ground, to see the business side of the blood industry. The office was opulent in a way that made his stomach turn. Marble floors, silk curtains, furniture that probably cost more than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes. The arena master sat behind a desk made from some exotic wood, looking every bit the successful businessman. "You've been profitable," the arena master said without preamble. "More than I initially projected. The beast tamer angle is resonating with audiences. People love the narrative of man and monster working together. Very inspirational." The sarcasm was barely hidden. "So I'm prepared to offer you something special. A contract. 5 years of exclusive fights. In exchange, you get 15% of ticket sales for your matches, better living conditions, and guaranteed medical care." 15% sounded generous until you did the math. The arena held 50,000 people. Even if only half the seats were filled, even if tickets were cheap, 15% of that was still substantial coin. But that money would be controlled by the arena. Doled out in allowances, used as leverage to ensure compliance. "And if I refuse?" The arena master's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you remain property. Standard slave conditions, minimum care, maximum matches. I'd hate to see that happen, but business is business." He didn't sign. Not that day. The arena master let him leave with the contract, told him to think about it. But the message was clear. Sign and be a well-compensated prisoner, or refuse and be a suffering prisoner. Either way, prisoner. That night, sitting in his cell with Ash curled in the corner, he tried to find a third option. There had to be a way out that didn't involve either selling himself into gilded slavery or being ground down by brutal conditions. He reached out with his magic, not toward anything specific, just feeling the shape of the prison around him. The colosseum was saturated with ambient mana. Decades of magical combat had soaked into the very stones. Enchantments layered upon enchantments, wards and barriers and detection systems all woven together in a complex web. He couldn't break through that. Not with his current level of power. But maybe he didn't need to break through. Maybe he just needed to understand it better. He spent hours that night mapping the magical infrastructure with his senses, learning which wards were strong and which were just for show, finding the gaps and weaknesses that existed in any sufficiently complex system. It was slow work, exhausting work. But it gave him something the arena master hadn't anticipated: information, knowledge of the prison's architecture, understanding of its vulnerabilities. And with that understanding came the beginnings of a plan. Not for immediate escape. He wasn't strong enough yet, and Ash couldn't fit through the gaps he'd found. But for eventual escape. For a freedom that didn't require anyone's permission. The next morning, he told Kyle about his discovery. The veteran fighter listened in silence, his expression unreadable. "You're talking about escape," Kyle said finally. "Real escape, not just improved conditions." "Yes. It's suicide. Even if you make it out of the Colosseum, you're branded. Everyone knows what arena slaves look like. You'd be caught within a day." "Maybe. But staying is definitely prison. At least escape is possibly freedom." Kale was quiet for a long moment. Then, "If you're serious about this, you'll need help. More than just me. You'll need allies who can operate outside the arena. People who can arrange for new identities, safe passage. Things slaves can't access on their own." "Where would I find people like that?" "In the last place you'd expect, among the arena's paying customers." It sounded insane, but Kale explained the logic. Some nobles bet on arena matches not for entertainment, but as business investments. They developed relationships with promising fighters, offered patronage, because a champion they'd supported early could become a valuable connection later. If our protagonist could identify the right noble, someone with both resources and a reason to help, he might be able to negotiate actual freedom instead of just improved slavery. The problem was access. Slaves didn't interact with nobles. The closest he'd gotten to the upper classes was seeing them in the stands. Faceless masses screaming for blood. But beast tamer matches were different. They attracted a more exclusive crowd. People who appreciated the skill involved rather than just wanting to see death. People who might, possibly, be interested in a proposition. His next match was scheduled for 2 days later, against another beast tamer and their thunder wolf. Dangerous opponent, but manageable with Ash's help. The real challenge would be finding a way to signal his availability to potential patrons without being obvious enough to alert the arena's security. Kyle had an idea. Beast tamers sometimes have their creatures perform tricks between combat sequences. Crowd-pleasing displays. If you can get Ash to do something sophisticated enough, it'll catch the attention of the nobles who understand magic. That's your opening. Convincing Ash to perform tricks was harder than fighting. The Drake had no interest in entertainment, but he framed it differently. Not tricks, strategic displays of capability, showing potential allies what they could do together. Ash seemed to understand that logic, or at least tolerated the practice sessions. The day of the match arrived. The crowd was larger than usual, word having spread about the rising beast tamer. When he and Ash entered the arena, he could feel the weight of thousands of eyes, but he forced himself to focus on the handful that mattered. The private boxes where the richest nobles sat. Those were the people he needed to reach. The fight itself was brutal. The Thunder Wolf was fast, aggressive, and its handler knew how to coordinate with it effectively. Lightning crackled around the beast, making direct contact dangerous. But Ash had advantages too. Size, armor, and the ability to work with a partner who could drain electrical magic before it fully formed. They won, but barely. The Thunder Wolf's handler went down hard, and the wolf itself retreated with severe injuries. The crowd roared approval. This had been a real contest, not a scripted slaughter. Perfect. Before the guards could usher them off stage, our protagonist had Ash perform the sequence they'd practiced. The drake reared up, spread its wing flaps to their full impressive span, and released a perfectly controlled stream of toxic breath that formed a spiral pattern in the air. Then, at his mental command, he absorbed the toxin back into himself, demonstrating the magical link between them. It was showy. It was unnecessary for combat. It was exactly the kind of display that would signal to knowledgeable observers that this wasn't just a beast tamer getting lucky. This was someone with genuine magical sophistication. In the private boxes, he saw several nobles lean forward with interest. One in particular, a woman in dark blue robes with silver threading, watched with an intensity that suggested more than casual curiosity. When their eyes met across the arena, she gave the slightest nod. Message received. 2 days later, a guard delivered an unusual summons. One of the private training rooms had been reserved for him, and he had a visitor. The guard's tone suggested this was someone important, someone who'd paid well for the privilege. The training room was nicer than anywhere he'd been allowed in the Colosseum. Actual windows, padded floors, equipment that wasn't falling apart. And waiting in the center of the room was the noble woman from the private box. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought. Maybe 30, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged somewhere. Her robes were even more impressive up close, woven with actual protective enchantments that shimmered faintly in the light. "My name is Magistrate Vera," she said without preamble. "I represent a faction within the Noble Council that's been watching your progress with interest." That display with the drake was clever. Subtle enough that most of the crowd just thought it was flashy. Sophisticated enough that anyone with real magical knowledge recognized what you were actually demonstrating. He didn't respond immediately, trying to gauge where this was going. Vera continued. "The arena master has you under contract negotiation. He wants to lock you in for 5 years. I'm here to offer an alternative. My faction will purchase your contract outright. You'd fight for our sponsored arena instead of this one. Better conditions, more freedom between matches, and after 3 years of service, we'd grant you full freedom with citizenship papers." It was a better deal than the arena master's offer. Substantially better. Which meant it probably had substantial strings attached. "What's the catch?" Vera smiled. "Smart question. The catch is that our arena caters to a more discerning clientele. The fights are more dangerous, more elaborate. We stage scenarios that tell stories rather than just putting bodies in the sand. Your survival rate would actually be lower than staying here, but the payoff for surviving is real freedom instead of permanent slavery." "Why me specifically?" "Because you're developing a skill set we need. Beast taming combined with that unusual absorption magic. We're planning a major event 6 months from now, a recreation of the ancient war between the dragon riders and the chaos mages. We need someone who can actually bond with a drake and fight at the level the story requires. You're the first viable candidate we've found. 6 months of more dangerous fights in exchange for eventual freedom. It was a gamble. But staying in the current arena was a guarantee of permanent imprisonment. The choice, such as it was, seemed clear. "I need guarantees," he said. "Written contract, verified by an independent magistrate, and I need the same deal extended to someone else." "The veteran fighter in the cage next to yours?" So she'd done her research. "Yes, Kyle. He's the reason I'm still alive. If you want me, you get both of us." Vera considered this. The veteran is past his prime. His value to us is limited. But I respect loyalty. "Fine. Both of you. But the contract terms apply equally. 3 years, then freedom. If either of you dies before then, the deal is void for both." It was manipulative, binding their fates together so neither would take unnecessary risks. But it was also the best offer he was likely to get. He accepted. The transfer happened within a week. One morning, guards came to collect him and Kyle, along with Ash, who'd been classified as his property for legal purposes. They were loaded into a covered wagon, along with a dozen other fighters who'd been purchased by various nobles. The arena master watched them go with the expression of someone who'd just lost a profitable investment. But the contract Vera's people had paid was substantial enough that he couldn't refuse. The new arena was on the other side of the city, in a district that catered to wealthier clientele. Where the Crimson Colosseum was massive and crude, designed for maximum capacity, this place was smaller, but infinitely more sophisticated. The Crystal Gardens, they called it. Built with transparent magical barriers that let spectators see fights from impossible angles, with environmental controls that could transform the arena floor into any terrain imaginable. The holding facilities were better too. Not cages, but actual rooms with doors. Locked doors, sure, but rooms nonetheless. Beds instead of stone floors. Windows with views of the sky. It was still prison, but it was prison with pretensions of being something more civilized. Kyle took in the new surroundings with cynical eyes. Nicer cage. Same trap. Don't let the improved conditions fool you. They bought us because we're useful. The moment we stop being useful, we become liabilities. He wasn't wrong. But for now, useful was better than disposable, and 3 years with a real endgame was better than 5 years with a vague promise. The training regimen in the new arena was intense in different ways. They didn't just want him to win fights. They wanted him to win specific fights in specific ways, following narrative arcs that would satisfy the Crystal Gardens' sophisticated audience. He was assigned an actual combat instructor, a retired arena champion named Marcus, who was one of the best swordsmen in the city. Wait, Marcus? That name triggered a memory. The first opponent he'd ever faced in the Crimson Colosseum had been named Marcus the Breaker, who he'd killed in his debut match. This Marcus noticed his reaction. Different Marcus, the instructor said dryly, though I heard about what happened to the Breaker. Impressive for a complete novice. Stupid lucky, but impressive. Over the following weeks, Marcus transformed his fighting style from scrappy survival tactics into something approaching actual technique. The absorption magic remained his core advantage, but now he learned how to fight properly even when the magic wasn't available. Footwork, timing, distance management, all the fundamentals he'd been skipping over in favor of raw desperation. Ash's training was equally intensive. The Drake was introduced to other magical beasts in controlled settings, learning to coordinate not just with him, but with environmental hazards and magical obstacles. The Crystal Gardens specialized in elaborate setups, and their creatures needed to be smart enough to handle complexity. His first match in the new arena was scheduled for 3 weeks after arrival. Enough time to learn the basics of their style. Not enough time to truly master anything. The narrative they'd chosen for his debut was classic underdog redemption. Former slave rises through talent and determination. The opponent would be another beast tamer. Someone competent but not exceptional. Chosen specifically to make him look good. But when he walked into the Crystal Gardens main arena for the first time, he realized why this place charged 10 times the admission of the Crimson Colosseum. The floor was transparent crystalline material, and beneath it swam magical constructs that looked like tropical fish made of light. The walls could shift and reconfigure, creating labyrinthine layouts or open spaces as needed. The ceiling was an illusion showing a perfect summer sky, complete with moving clouds and the occasional bird. It was beautiful in a way that made the brutality about to happen even more jarring. His opponent was a beast tamer with a pair of shadow panthers, sleek predators that could blend into darkness and strike from unexpected angles. The match started in an open arena configuration, but Marcus had warned him that would change mid-fight. The Crystal Gardens loved environmental shifts that forced fighters to adapt on the fly. The shadow panthers were fast and coordinated, working together to flank and confuse. Ash's size made the drake a bigger target, but also harder to take down quickly. Our protagonist focused on using his absorption magic to dispel the shadow-blending enchantments, making the panthers visible so Ash could actually fight them. 5 minutes in, the arena floor began to shift. Crystalline walls rose from the floor, creating a maze structure that separated him from Ash and divided the shadow panthers. The crowd loved it. This was the complexity they paid for. Now it became a game of navigation and prediction, trying to reunite with Ash while avoiding being isolated by the panthers. His magic proved invaluable in unexpected ways. The crystalline walls were actually solidified mana, and he could drain them partially, creating gaps to move through. The Shadow Panther's handler hadn't accounted for that level of versatility. Within minutes, the careful maze strategy fell apart as he simply created his own paths. When he and Ash finally cornered the handler, the man yielded rather than fight to the death. The Crystal Gardens allowed that, encouraged it even. Survival meant the fighter could perform again, and good fighters were expensive to replace. The crowd's applause was polite rather than thunderous. This audience didn't scream themselves hoarse. They appreciated technical skill with refined enthusiasm. It was weird after months of the Crimson Colosseum's raw energy, but not unpleasant. Backstage, Magistrate Vera was waiting. Well executed. The wall-draining technique wasn't in your reported skill set. Good improvisation. The next match will be more challenging. We're accelerating your progression toward the Dragon Rider event. How much more challenging? You'll be facing Severin the Blade Saint in 2 weeks. He's a crowd favorite. Theatrical, skilled, dangerous, but not lethal unless necessary. The narrative is that you're being tested by a legend. You're not expected to win, but you're expected to give a good showing. Make it interesting for at least 10 minutes, and we'll consider it a success. Severin the Blade Saint. Even he'd heard of that name. One of the Crystal Garden's star performers, someone who fought with such technical precision that other fighters paid to watch his matches just to study his technique. This wasn't a test he was meant to survive easily. Kale's assessment was blunt. They're pushing you hard, seeing if you break before the big event. If you survive Severin, they'll know you can handle the Dragon Rider scenario. If you don't survive, they'll have gotten their money's worth from the spectacle. Encouraging. Truth usually isn't. But here's the thing. Severin is good, but he's formulaic. He has about 30 techniques he cycles through, mixing them up to keep opponents guessing. If you can recognize the patterns, you can counter them. I'll help you study recordings of his previous matches. The Crystal Gardens kept detailed archives of all their major fights, available for fighters to study. Over the next 2 weeks, he watched Severin's matches obsessively. Kyle was right. The Blade Saint was incredibly skilled, but he fought within a defined system. Recognizing the setup for each technique became possible with enough study. But knowing what was coming and being able to counter it were very different problems. Severin was fast, precise, and had decades of experience. Even if the techniques were familiar, the execution would be flawless. He needed an edge that Severin wouldn't expect. The solution came from an unexpected source. Ash. During one of their training sessions, the Drake demonstrated a new behavior. When he used his absorption magic, Ash could feel the energy flowing and started instinctively moving to create optimal angles for the magical pull. They developed unconscious coordination, each anticipating the other's movements. If he could apply that same principle against Severin, using absorption not just as a defensive technique, but as a way to create openings that Ash could exploit, they might have a chance. Not to win, necessarily, but to make it interesting enough that the crowd would be satisfied. The day of the match arrived. The Crystal Gardens was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only in the upper galleries. Severin the Blade Saint commanded that kind of draw. Our protagonist was announced as the rising star, the beast tamer who'd shown unusual magical versatility. The narrative framing was clear. Student versus master. New generation versus old guard. Severin entered the arena to thunderous applause. He was older than expected, maybe 50, with gray touching his temples and scars marking his arms. But the way he moved suggested age hadn't slowed him at all. His weapon was a single longsword, plain and unenchanted, because he didn't need magical enhancement to be dangerous. The match began without pageantry. Severin simply drew his blade and advanced. The first exchange lasted 3 seconds and left our protagonist with a shallow cut across his shoulder. Severin's speed was inhuman. The second exchange lasted 2 seconds and forced him into a desperate backpedal. This wasn't going to last 10 minutes at this rate. He stopped trying to match Severin blade to blade and instead focused on creating distance, letting Ash harass the Blade Saint while he worked on a different strategy. Severin adapted smoothly, his technique shifting to account for fighting both opponents. But every adaptation required a split second of decision-making, and that's when the absorption magic could be most effective. He started draining ambient mana from the arena itself, creating small zones where magic simply didn't work properly. Severin's movements were pure skill rather than enhancement, so he wasn't directly affected. But Ash's natural magical senses could track these dead zones. They became an invisible battlefield within the visible one, areas where Ash knew to strike and Severin couldn't see. The crowd started to notice the tactical depth. This wasn't just a skilled veteran beating up a newcomer. This was chess. Severin recognized it too, and his expression shifted from polite professional interest to genuine engagement. He started taking the fight seriously, not because he was in danger, but because it was actually challenging. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The arena's environmental systems activated, creating patches of difficult terrain, testing both fighters' adaptability. Severin navigated them with practiced ease. Our protagonist and Ash struggled more but used the obstacles creatively, turning disadvantages into ambush points. At the 20-minute mark, something shifted. Severin overextended on a strike, just slightly, and the absorption magic caught the excess energy from his movement, creating a tiny stumble. Ash was there instantly, forcing Severin into an awkward dodge. For just a moment, the legendary Blade Saint was off balance. Our protagonist's blade touched Severin's side. Not a deep cut. Barely a scratch. But first blood. The crowd went wild. Nobody expected the newcomer to actually tag Severin, let alone force him into a defensive position. Severin smiled. A real smile, full of genuine appreciation. Then he ended the match with a technique so fast our protagonist didn't even see it coming. One moment he was on his feet, the next he was on his back with Severin's blade at his throat. "Well fought," Severin said quietly, only loud enough for him to hear. "You've got potential. Don't waste it dying in some elaborate spectacle." The crowd's applause was deafening. Both fighters had performed beautifully, delivering exactly the kind of technical showcase the Crystal Garden's audience craved. As guards helped him to his feet, Magistrate Vera appeared at the arena's edge, her expression satisfied. "Excellent work. The Dragon Rider event is confirmed for you. 6 months to prepare. Don't die between now and then." 6 months. Half a year of intensive training, dangerous matches, and pushing his abilities to their absolute limit. Half a year until the event that would either earn his freedom or kill him spectacularly. But for now, tonight, he'd survived Severin the Blade Saint. He'd earned respect from one of the arena's legends, and he'd proven to himself that he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was actually becoming something. The question was whether that something would be a legend or just another cautionary tale. Time would tell. And the arena was very good at telling time in corpses and survivors. The 6 months leading to the Dragon Rider event blurred together into a relentless cycle of training, fighting, and evolution. Magistrate Vera's faction invested heavily in his development, bringing in specialized instructors for magical theory, combat choreography, and the historical context of the story they'd be telling. The Dragon Rider Wars had been real, 1,000 years ago, and the Crystal Gardens prided itself on historical accuracy in its elaborate spectacles. He learned that the original dragon riders weren't just beast tamers. They were bonded partners with their dragons, sharing magic and consciousness to a degree that made human and dragon almost a single entity. The chaos mages they'd fought were practitioners of wild, reality-warping magic that made his absorption techniques look tame by comparison. The war had devastated entire continents before ending in mutual destruction. "You won't recreate real dragon magic," his magical theory instructor explained. "That knowledge died with the last riders, but you can approximate it. Your absorption ability creates a magical circuit between you and the drake. If you can learn to share energy instead of just taking it, you could create something similar to the old bonds." Sharing energy was harder than absorbing it. Absorption was taking, which his magic excelled at. Giving required control and finesse he'd never developed. But Ash proved a willing partner in the experiments. The drake seemed to understand on some instinctual level that this could make them both stronger. The breakthrough came 3 months before the event. During a practice session, he was exhausted from repeated magical draining exercises. His internal reserves were depleted. On reflex, he tried to pull energy from Ash to replenish himself. But instead of just taking, he felt Ash push back, offering power freely. The circuit completed. Energy flowed both ways. For 10 seconds, he experienced the world through draconic senses. Saw heat patterns instead of colors. Felt magnetic fields as physical pressure. Tasted the chemical composition of air. It was overwhelming, alien, and absolutely intoxicating. When the connection broke, both he and Ash collapsed from the strain. Marcus, who'd been supervising the session, looked concerned. "What just happened?" "I think we just discovered how dragon riders actually worked." Word of the breakthrough reached Magistrate Vera immediately. She arrived at the training facility, within hours, bringing her own magical experts to observe and document. Over the next week, he and Ash practiced the shared consciousness repeatedly, gradually extending the duration and control. They discovered limitations. The connection required physical contact to initiate. It couldn't be maintained for more than a few minutes without causing magical backlash in both participants, and it left both of them vulnerable during the connection process. But the advantages were staggering. While bonded, he had access to Ash's physical power and magical senses. Ash gained access to his tactical thinking and magical techniques. They became something greater than the sum of parts. Exactly what the Crystal Gardens needed for their Dragon Rider event. His regular matches continued throughout the preparation period. Vera's faction kept him in the arena rotation, both to maintain public interest and to test his evolving abilities. Each fight was different, carefully scripted to showcase specific skills while building toward the main event. There was the match against the illusionist, where he learned to use his absorption magic to dispel false images and track the real opponent through magical signatures. That fight taught him to trust Ash's senses over his own eyes. There was the gauntlet match against 3 sequential opponents without rest periods, testing stamina and resource management. He discovered that by entering the bonded state briefly between fights, he and Ash could share energy reserves and recover faster than normal. There was the environmental hazard match in an arena filled with unstable magical storms. He learned to absorb the chaotic energy and redirect it, turning the environment from enemy to weapon. Each victory added to his growing reputation. The Crystal Gardens started marketing him as the Bonded One, building mystique around his unusual relationship with Ash. Betting on his matches became popular among nobles, who thought they understood magic well enough to predict outcomes. Most of them lost money. His fighting style was too unconventional, too adaptive, too willing to try impossible things. Kyle fought his own matches in parallel, serving as a veteran counterpoint to the rising star narrative. They lived in adjacent quarters now, actual apartments rather than cells, with the freedom to move around the Crystal Gardens complex during non-match hours. It wasn't true freedom, but it was closer than either had experienced in years. 2 years and 9 months left on the contract, Kyle said one evening. They'd developed a habit of tracking the remaining time like prisoners marking walls. Assuming we both survive the Dragon Rider event? You think we won't? I think they're planning something bigger than they've told us. Magistrate Vera's faction is investing too much money in this. The historical recreation is cover for something else. I just can't figure out what. Kale's paranoia proved justified 2 months before the event. Vera summoned both of them to a private meeting in her estate, away from the Crystal Garden's oversight. The estate was obscenely luxurious, all marble and gold, the kind of wealth that made the arena's blood business seem like pocket change. The Dragon Rider event has attracted attention from the Imperial Court, Vera began without preamble. The Emperor himself plans to attend. This is unprecedented for an arena match, even in the Crystal Gardens. It creates both opportunity and danger for all of us. The Emperor, the single most powerful human in the known world, a man whose word could elevate families or destroy them. His attendance meant this event had political implications beyond entertainment. Vera continued. There are factions in the court who oppose my political agenda. They'll use the event to embarrass me if anything goes wrong. But if it succeeds spectacularly, it strengthens my position considerably. Your freedom contract includes a clause about exceptional performance bonuses. If the Emperor is sufficiently impressed, I can negotiate your immediate release instead of waiting 3 years. And if we fail to impress, Kyle asked, then you serve the full 3 years under much less pleasant conditions, because I'll have lost the political capital to protect you. Vera's expression hardened. So let me be very clear. This isn't just about putting on a good show anymore. This is about delivering a performance so exceptional that it becomes legendary. Do you understand? They understood. The stakes had just multiplied beyond anything they'd anticipated. This wasn't survival anymore. This was perfection or nothing. The final 2 months were brutal. The training intensified to levels that pushed both him and Ash to breaking points. New techniques, new combinations, new risks. The choreography for the Dragon Rider event was finalized. A 15-minute sequence of combat, magic, and aerial maneuvers that would tell the story of the ancient war's climactic battle. His opponent would be Severin the Blade Saint, playing the role of the Chaos Mage General. Severin had been training just as intensely, developing techniques that approximated historical chaos magic's reality-warping effects. The final battle would pit the Dragon Rider's bonded partnership against the Chaos Mage's impossible individual power. 1 week before the event, during a full dress rehearsal, everything went wrong. The bonded connection between him and Ash destabilized mid-flight. They crashed into the arena floor from 30 feet up. Both survived, barely. He woke up in the medical facility with 3 broken ribs and a magical backlash that left him unable to access his power for 2 days. The healers fixed the physical injuries, but the psychological damage was worse. He'd lost confidence in the one technique that made the entire plan possible. If the bonded state could fail catastrophically during rehearsal, it could fail during the actual event. In front of the Emperor, in front of 50,000 spectators, in front of everyone whose opinion determined his future. Severin visited him in the medical facility. The legendary fighter looked genuinely concerned. I've seen that look before, Severin said. The fear after a technique betrays you. Here's what you need to understand. The technique didn't fail. You did. You tried to force the connection instead of allowing it. The Drake knows this instinctively. You're the one who forgot. How do I fix it? Stop trying to control everything. The bond is partnership, not domination. Trust Ash to be Ash. Trust yourself to be yourself. And trust that together you're something new. Severin paused. The Dragon Riders weren't great because they controlled dragons. They were great because they surrendered control to something larger than themselves. It was both the most helpful and least actionable advice he'd ever received. But over the next week, as his magic recovered and he tentatively practiced bonding again, he started to understand. The times it worked best were when he stopped thinking about it as a technique and started experiencing it as truth. He wasn't bonding with Ash. He was acknowledging that they'd already been bonded, and the magic was just making it visible. The day of the Dragon Rider event arrived. The Crystal Gardens had been transformed for the occasion. The arena floor expanded to triple its normal size to accommodate aerial combat. Magical barriers had been reinforced to protect spectators from the more dangerous effects planned for the show. Every seat was filled, with additional scrying screens set up in the city plaza for overflow crowds who couldn't get tickets. The Imperial box sat at the arena's highest point, draped in gold and violet, the Emperor's colors. When the Emperor himself appeared, the entire Colosseum fell silent. He was younger than expected, maybe 40, with the kind of presence that filled a room even from a distance. Magistrate Vera stood in her own box, looking tense despite her outward composure. This was her gambit. Everything she'd worked for rode on the next 15 minutes. Our protagonist waited in the preparation area with Ash, both of them dressed in armor designed to evoke the historical dragon riders. Light, flexible, decorated with symbols from the ancient texts. Severin was in the opposite area, preparing his Chaos Mage costume. A functionary appeared. 5 minutes. Remember, this isn't a fight to the death. It's a performance, but make it look real. Then they were walking into the arena, and the crowd's roar hit like a physical force. 50,000 people screaming welcome. Ash spread wings and roared back, a sound that echoed across the city. They took their position at one end of the expanded arena floor. Severin entered from the opposite end, his costume making him look like a warlock from Nightmare. Dark robes that seemed to absorb light. A staff that crackled with destabilized energy. When he raised his hands, magical storms began to form above the arena. The announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum, enhanced to supernatural volume. 1,000 years ago, the world burned in the Dragon Rider Wars. Today, we recreate the final battle between light and chaos. Witness the power that shaped our history. The performance began. What followed was the most intense 15 minutes of his life. Not because of physical danger, though there was plenty of that, but because every movement, every spell, every moment of bonded flight with Ash had to be perfect. Had to sell the narrative, had to convince everyone watching that they were witnessing something that mattered. Severin was magnificent. His chaos magic effects were terrifying, even knowing they were choreographed. Reality bent around his attacks. Space twisted. Time seemed to slow and speed randomly in localized areas. It was illusion and real magic woven together so seamlessly that even knowing the tricks, it was impossible to see the seams. He and Ash fought back with everything they'd learned. The bonded state held perfectly this time, because he wasn't trying to force it. They moved as one entity. Human tactical thinking merged with draconic instinct. When Severin launched an attack, they knew how to counter before conscious thought could process the threat. The aerial sequences drew gasps from the crowd. Ash soaring with him on the drake's back, both of them linked in the bonded state, moving in 3 dimensions with grace that seemed impossible. Severin's chaos magic created obstacles that they navigated through, over, around, each near miss perfectly timed for maximum dramatic effect. The climactic sequence had them locked in a magical deadlock, the Dragon Rider's absorption power struggling against the Chaos Mage's reality-warping might. Ash on the ground channeling energy to him. Severin standing tall with magical storms swirling around his staff. Both of them pouring everything into the moment. The script called for a mutual defeat. Both powers canceling out in a spectacular explosion of light that would end the performance. But in that moment, with 50,000 people watching, with the Emperor's eyes on them, with everything riding on the outcome, our protagonist made a choice. He pushed further than the script called for. Drew more power from Ash than they'd practiced. Not to win the performance, but to make it real. To show something that transcended choreography. To demonstrate that the bonded state wasn't just a trick. It was genuine magic that could rival the legends. The absorption magic surged beyond anything he'd achieved before. It pulled not just from Severin's attacks, but from the ambient magical saturation of the entire arena. Every enchantment, every ward, every bit of residual power from 1,000 previous matches. It all came flooding into the bonded circuit between him and Ash. Severin's eyes went wide. This wasn't scripted. But the legendary fighter adapted instantly, pouring more power into his chaos magic, matching the escalation, understanding that they were creating something unrehearsed and potentially amazing. The explosion when their powers finally broke was real, uncontrolled, massive. The magical barriers around the arena strained to contain it. Light filled the entire crystal gardens, bright enough that spectators shielded their eyes. When the light faded, both he and Severin were on the ground, actually unconscious, drained completely. Ash was barely standing, trembling from magical exhaustion. But the crowd was silent in that perfect moment of shock before realization hit. Then they erupted, not in applause, in screams of absolute euphoria. They'd witnessed something genuine, something that went beyond performance into actual magical achievement. Even the nobles who'd seen everything were on their feet, faces showing real emotion. In the imperial box, the emperor stood slowly. He began to clap. Just him at first. Then his attendants joined, then the entire colosseum followed his lead. The applause built and built until it became thunder. Our protagonist regained consciousness to find himself in the medical facility again. But this time, Magistrate Vera was there, and she was crying. Crying with relief and joy. "He loved it," she gasped. "The Emperor loved it. He's calling it the greatest arena performance in 200 years. He wants to meet you personally, and he's agreed to grant my petition." "What petition?" "For your immediate release. You and Kyle both. Full citizenship, cleared records, everything. You're free. You actually did it. You're free." The words didn't make sense at first. Free. After 10 years of slavery. After months of thinking he'd need to serve 3 more years. Free. Just like that. Because he'd given a performance that impressed the right person. Kyle appeared in the doorway, looking equally stunned. "They're processing our release papers now. By tomorrow we'll be citizens. We can go wherever we want. Free." It still didn't feel real when they walked out of the Crystal Gardens 3 days later. The release had required paperwork, verification, removal of slave brands through expensive magical procedures, and formal statements before the municipal authorities. But it was done. He stood in the city plaza with Kyle, both of them holding citizenship papers that had cost so much blood and pain to earn. Ash was with them, classified as a bonded companion rather than property. Around them, the city moved with normal life. People going about their business, completely unaware that 2 former slaves had just achieved the impossible. "So what now?" Kyle asked. "We're free to go anywhere, do anything. What does someone do with that?" He didn't have an immediate answer. Freedom was a concept he'd dreamed about for years, but the actual reality of it was overwhelming. No one owned him. No one could tell him what to do. The future was completely undefined. Severin found them in the plaza. The Blade Saint had a proposition. "The Crystal Gardens wants to hire both of you as free fighters. Real contracts, real pay, the option to refuse matches. You'd fight because you want to, not because you're forced to. It's good money, and you'd be working with people who respect you." It was tempting. The arena was familiar. The work was something they knew how to do. But it also felt like trading one form of confinement for another, even if the terms were better. "We'll think about it," our protagonist said. Magistrate Vera had a different offer. Her faction wanted to sponsor him as a bonded rider for the Imperial military. The techniques he'd developed with Ash had military applications. They could provide resources, training, opportunities to work on cutting-edge magical research. also tempting, also potentially limiting. In the end, they chose neither. Not immediately, anyway. They rented a small apartment in a quiet district, spent a month doing nothing but existing without purpose, learning what it felt like to wake up without schedules or threats. It was uncomfortable at first, the absence of structure, but gradually it became the most precious thing either of them had experienced. Our protagonist spent hours with Ash, maintaining the bonded connection not for performance or survival, but just to understand it better, to explore what they'd created together. The Drake seemed content with that, the absence of violence and crowds allowing aspects of its personality to emerge that had been suppressed by arena life. Kale started teaching swordsmanship to local kids, discovering he had a talent for instruction that had been wasted in the arena. He was good at it, patient in ways that combat had never allowed him to be. The dead look in his eyes gradually faded, replaced by something approaching peace. 6 months after their release, our protagonist accepted a modified version of Magistrate Vera's offer. Not military work, but research. Studying the bonded state with academic mages who wanted to understand the principles rather than weaponize them. It was quiet work, important work, work that might eventually restore knowledge that had been lost for 1,000 years. He kept a connection to the Crystal Gardens, occasionally agreeing to exhibition matches when they needed someone for special events. But on his terms, for his reasons. Sometimes he'd take the matches to test new techniques. Sometimes he'd refuse because he didn't feel like it. The power to choose was intoxicating. Years later, when they'd written academic papers about bonded magic and trained new riders and built lives that extended far beyond the arena, someone asked him what the hardest part of his journey had been. Not the fights, he said. Not the pain or the fear or the near-death experiences. The hardest part had been believing, really believing, that someone who started with nothing could become something. That the world's opinion of your worth wasn't the final word on your value. That chains, whether physical or psychological, could actually be broken if you refused to accept them as permanent. The story of the slave who became an arena legend was one version of his life. But the real story, the one that mattered, was simpler. It was about someone who refused to let circumstances define limits, who found allies in unexpected places, who learned that strength wasn't just physical power, but the will to keep going when giving up would be easier. The arena had tried to break him, to use him, to profit from his suffering. Instead, he'd turned it into a stepping stone. Not easily, not without cost, but decisively. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Not the matches won, or the crowds impressed, or the emperor's approval. The real victory was sitting in his own apartment, with a Drake sleeping in the corner and papers scattered across a desk, doing work he chose to do, living a life he'd earned. From slave to legend to scholar. It was a strange path, but it was his path. And finally, after everything, that was enough.